Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the connections between soil health and water quality. This is the first in the Soil Builders Education and Action webinar series. I'm Natasha Duarte, the director of the Composting Association of Vermont, based in Heinsberg. Our association believes that increasing the use of compost in our communities will improve soil health, water quality, and our resistance to climate change. The Composting Association of Vermont works to advance the production and use of compost as vital to soil health through practices that contribute to water quality, plant vigor, and environmental resilience. We strive to demonstrate the value of compost through education, policy, outreach, and partnerships to reduce waste, capture energy, and create jobs. The Soil Builder workshops were developed to provide compost-related eco-literacy for Lake Champlain Basin decision makers, professionals, and advocates. Concerns about elevated phosphorus levels in the Lake Champlain Basin have contributed to confusion about when and how to use compost. There's a knowledge gap about specific benefits from using compost and how to modify current farming, site engineering, and landscaping practices to produce those benefits. We developed the Soil Builders curriculum to start addressing this gap. Because we're not yet able to hold these workshops in person, we decided to provide the Soil Builders curriculum as a webinar series. So today is the Soil Health and Water Quality webinar. There's going to be a pre-recorded webinar talking about the drivers for clean water and healthy soil that get into sort of the background and regulations that are driving this work, best management practices for compost and compost-based products, and then education and action. So what are the next steps? How can you take the information from the Soil Builders curriculum and actually put it to use in your communities or in your work? All of the webinars will be recorded, and the resource materials that are referenced will also be shared. I'd like to take a minute to thank all of my project partners for the Soil Builders project and give additional thanks to my board of directors for their input and oversight along the way, as well as thank the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission in partnership with the Lake Champlain Basin program, who provided generous funding for this project. With that, I'll introduce our speakers today. Marc Companion coordinates green infrastructure outreach through a joint position shared between the Lake Champlain Sea Grant Institute and the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. He's also a lecturer in environmental sciences at UVM's Rubenstein School. Marc has over 25 years of experience in water resources, ecological design, environmental education, and community development in the US and overseas. Marc also worked in Kenya and South Sudan for 6.5 years, managing water infrastructure and natural resource conservation programs. He has a master's degree in natural resource planning and a bachelor's in civil engineering. Athena Lee Bradley is an independent compost consultant providing instruction for organics and food scrap management, composting, and manure management trainings, as well as technical assistance to businesses, public agencies, schools, communities, and households. She's written several organics management guidance documents and numerous other instructional materials. Athena attended the Maine Compost School and several other compost operator trainings. She has a master's degree in environmental policy and a bachelor's in environmental studies. Athena joined the CAV Board of Directors in 2018. So thank you both for being with us today to share this Soil Builders curriculum. And Marc, I'm going to pass it over to you to get us started.
Thank you, Natasha. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start with a short introduction to stormwater and runoff, and then we'll talk about healthy ecosystems and how they are influencing water quality. And then we'll do an introduction to what is soil. And then I'll hand it over to Athena, who will help us learn more about compost, soil health, and water quality. So stormwater in the Lake Champlain Basin is an important issue. This is a map of the Lake Champlain Basin, and it's the area, the catchment area where water drains into Lake Champlain. And what's notable is that the surface area of the drainage area is almost 18 times larger than the surface area of the lake. So what happens in the drainage basin of Lake Champlain has a tremendous impact and influence on water quality within Lake Champlain. The Lake Champlain Basin is comprised of multiple watersheds or drainage areas or catchment areas where water that falls on the land will make its way downhill through various land uses and ultimately to Lake Champlain. Within the basin, in any given watershed, there are natural areas such as forests and wetlands and rivers and streams, agricultural land uses, which have a unique influence on water quality. We have the built environment, our neighborhoods, communities, and cities, which are comprised of impervious surfaces such as parking lots and driveways and roads. And then underlying all of this is the soil that we are living on and with. And different soils have different abilities for affecting water quality. Compacted soils do not allow water to soak in very well, so water will run off quickly. Rich, organic, and healthy soils have the ability to act like a sponge where water will soak in and follow various pathways, whether to the groundwater or to streams. In natural areas, when rainwater falls on these, much of it soaks into the ground. As you can see from the center of this image, maybe up to 20% of the rainfall that falls on a natural area will actually run off. Most of it is absorbed into the ground and becomes part of the soil matrix. Here's an image of an upland forest with the beginnings of some surface runoff and some small rivulets that will soon become streams. Much of the rain that falls in this area does not even get to be surface runoff. It soaks into the ground because of the rich, healthy soils underlying these natural areas. We know of wetlands as tremendous resources for water storage and water purification. There's lots of filtration and healthy things going on. So natural areas not only help absorb rainwater into the ground, but also can store and reduce the flows so that they happen over longer periods of time rather than short, quick bursts of flow. The built environment has a different relationship with water quality and how water interacts with the landscape. Portions of our built environment are comprised of impervious surfaces, such as sidewalks, driveways, buildings, roads, parking lots, where water does not soak very well or at all into the ground. There's a much higher percentage of rainfall on this that would run off and make its way into streams, often much more quickly than if these impervious surfaces were better at soaking up rainwater. So here's the rain event with water falling on a parking lot. You can see it's sheet flow. Water flows quickly over these surfaces, picking up pollutants and oil drippings, sediments, and bringing that into storm drains and grates, which can then quickly be connected to streams and rivers and ultimately the lake. A result can be a small scale of erosion, such as what we might see on a rural driveway, or much larger erosion events, depending on the flow situation in that area. And in extreme conditions, serious damage can be done by the large volumes of water coming very quickly over the landscape and reaching various parts of the community or infrastructure that cannot handle those volumes. Another important aspect of stormwater and stormwater management and water quality is the chemical aspect, the nutrient aspect of what's in stormwater. Like I said earlier, oil drippings, fertilizer from our lawns or from farms, and other chemicals that can make their way into the watershed or into the rivers and streams and down into bodies of water. In Lake Champlain, the pollutant of concern is phosphorus. And phosphorus is the primary management element that we use for water quality practices in our area. Phosphorus in the water can create algal blooms or harmful algal blooms, which, as we know, can create beach closings and other problems. And as part of the state of Vermont and in the basin's water quality management strategies, they're using something called the TMDL, total maximum daily load, which is essentially how much of this primary pollutant, this pollutant of concern, phosphorus, do we need to reduce in order to stay within water quality standards within the state. So too much phosphorus is not good. And so there's a whole suite of metrics and monitoring and tracking to measure how much of this nutrient, phosphorus, is in the watershed and making its way into waterways. Exacerbating all of this is climate change and how rainfall patterns are changing throughout the planet and even here in Vermont. We've seen larger storm events happen more frequently already, and modeling is projecting that there will be even greater frequency of large storms in the future. So more water will be coming more quickly on a regular basis in our neighborhoods, and therefore managing water flows is critical for water quality. Here's just a graph of rainfall patterns over the last century or so, and you can see within the last 20 or 30 years, we've been seeing larger storms more frequently, and this is a trend that we expect to continue. So how do natural systems deal with stormwater? What's going on in a forest and a forest floor such that there's very little surface runoff? Most of it is absorbed like a sponge into the forest floor. How do we enhance our soils so that they are better at being sponges to soak up rainwater, so that rainwater will soak into the ground right where it falls rather than flowing downstream into bodies of water? How do we ameliorate compact soils, which do not do a very good job at soaking up water, so that they can become healthier and actually become better sponges at soaking up water? How do we bring these strategies of natural systems into our built environment to help manage stormwater right on site or closer to where the rain falls, and enable nutrients and pollution and sediment to be taken care of at the same time on site? At a home level, water coming out of our gutters through downspouts, how can we encourage that water to soak into the ground right on our property? Here is a bioretention basin in Randolph, Vermont. It's a depression in a portion of the property where rainfall falling on that property is directed into this basin. It will temporarily fill up with water, 6 inches perhaps of water. And then within a 24-hour period, that stormwater will soak down into the soil, and then it will be returned to this grassy portion. Sometimes you see bioretention systems. Often you see them with lots of wetland plants and botanical garden-like beautifully landscape systems. Here's just a simple one with grass. But it's a depression to collect stormwater so that it's soak into the ground right on the property. Clean Water Act of 2015, Act 64, recognizes healthy soil as soil that is well developed, it's porous in structure, is chemically balanced, it supports a diverse microbial community, and has abundant organic matter. So healthy soils drain well, they act like sponges, they're good at infiltration, they resist disease and erosion. So what is soil? Soil is a porous fabric that is more than just the particles that we see. It's a composite, an aggregate of minerals, such as the soil particles themselves, the sand, the decomposed bedrock. It's also composed of other solid materials, which are the organic component, the living organisms, the biology, the both dead and alive, but also, just as important, soil voids within the pores of the soil, the spaces between the granules of the soil. And those are comprised of water and air and even little critters crawling around within those spaces and pores. So what is organic matter? Organic matter is the carbon-based life within the soil, both what's alive and also the residues, what's being excreted by those organisms, and also the dead portions, what's being decomposed. So organic matter is a rich collection of life in its various stages. Within the soil, there's a plethora of life from many different phyla and taxa. There are bacteria. In fact, 1 gram of soil, which is about the size of a pea, can hold more bacteria than we have people on the planet of Earth. Also within soil is a rich network of mycorrhizae and fungal systems and networks that are exchanging chemistry through various distances, from long distances to various organisms. We also have invertebrate animals, microscopic and even larger invertebrate animals crawling around within the soil and living and attaching and doing amazing things. There's incredible food webs and food chains of life within the soil. We'll now transfer over to a short video, and so we can have just a small little description from the folks at Penn State on what is healthy soil.
Soil is not just dirt. Soil quality has to do with the physical, biological, and chemical properties of soil. Today we're going to talk about some of the physical properties of soil, including soil organic matter and structure, water holding capacity and infiltration, as well as compaction.
A fertile and healthy soil is the basis for healthy plants, people, and planet. Soil organic matter is the very foundation for healthy and productive soil. But what is soil organic matter and what does it do for us? Organic matter is the living dead and very dead components of the soil. Topsoil generally only has 1 to 6% organic matter, but a 1% increase in organic matter can increase crop yields by 12%. Additions of organic matter increase biological activity and improve soil structure and aggregation, which in turn improve water infiltration and storage, decomposition, and nutrient release. Soils with high organic matter act like a sponge, holding more water and nutrients. Organic matter also feeds the soil bacteria, fungi, insects, and other beneficials, which improve soil structure and fight plant diseases. The texture of soil is inherent. It has a certain amount of sand, silt, and clay. We can't change that. But how those soil particles fit together, the structure of the soil, we can change. A good loam soil is going to be about 50% soil and 50% air and water spaces. To maintain plenty of pores full of air and water for plants, we want to have good crumb structure. Soil scientists call these crumbs aggregates. The small aggregates are bound together by chemical bonds from organic matter and clay. Bacteria and root hairs produce sticky substances that glue soil particles together. Fungi and root hairs wrap soil particles into balls. One important type of aggregate is the water-stable aggregate. The number of water-stable aggregates in your soil shows its capacity to sustain its structure under the most extreme conditions, like a heavy rainstorm. Here you can see that very water-stable aggregates maintain their structure even after soaking. Others melt away. Have any soils on your farm that after a heavy rainstorm dry and form a crust? What happens when another heavy rainstorm comes? The water runs off the soil crust, not infiltrating into the ground where we need it, and taking precious topsoil off of our field. Cover crops, compost, and perennial cover will feed the soil organisms that bind together soil aggregates and help maintain soil structure.
One important aspect of healthy soil is the interaction with the plants. Plants are a connection between the soil and what goes on in the soil and the atmosphere and life above. Plants are collecting energy from the sun, converting that energy into sugars and other great molecules in chemistry. And some of those molecules and sugars are pumped down to the roots and exuded from the roots into the soil. So the plants are actually helping create an energy source for the life within the soil itself. Here is a photo of some aquatic plants that float on the surface. They've been lifted out of the water so you can see the roots underneath, and you can see a massive amounts of surface area of root systems. Think of these as like apartments and condominiums for life. Lots of organisms, especially bacteria and other microbes, are attaching to the surface of these roots, benefiting from the sugars that are given off from the roots, and their biological activity in turn is providing nutrients and making nutrients accessible for the plant itself. And here's just an image of a lot of different interactions and chemistry going on between plants and the life within the soil, bacteria, mycorrhizal systems, and the microbial communities within the soil, all benefiting from the energy that is brought down from the atmosphere into the soil by the plants, and this mutualistic exchange of chemistry between the organisms in the soil and the plants themselves. And this dynamic relationship is one way that soil is really good at helping us manage some of the chemicals and chemistry that comes through from stormwater into the soil. So with that, I will hand it over to my colleague Athena, who will help us look more into strategies for building healthy soil. Athena, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you, Natasha, and thank you everybody for being on our webinar. So what is the relationship between healthy soil, compost, and water? One key to a healthy Lake Champlain ecosystem is developing healthy soils to restore native species habitat, nutrient filtration, flood resilience, and sediment retention. Understanding soil properties is critical to understanding soil erosion and reducing soil loss. Healthy soil can be a reservoir for moisture, organic material, carbon, and nutrients. However, when it's disturbed or degraded, soil cannot retain water and nutrients, and that's where compost can come in. So I know a lot of you have a background in compost, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, I am going to go over some basics on composting. So composting is an aerobic or with air oxygen requiring decomposition of organic materials by microorganisms under managed conditions. During composting, the decomposing microorganisms consume oxygen and generate heat, carbon dioxide, and moisture or water vapor. Composting reduces the volume and mass of raw materials. Composting supports local organics diversion from landfills where food scraps or other organics would decompose anaerobically to emit methane, odors, and leachate. And it keeps these organic resources locally available for soil improvement and fertility through application of compost, a dark, crumbly, humus-like material rich in organic matter. So here are a few examples of the many compost operations in Vermont. No matter the size or the type of compost operation, pretty much all composting is essentially the same. The goal is to meet the needs of the decomposing microorganisms and keep them happy and healthy. This is done through a carbon-nitrogen ratio of about 25 to 30 to 1, and this provides the energy and protein for the organisms. A recipe is developed through a mix of carbon and nitrogen feedstocks like yard trimmings, leaves, food scraps, animal manures, bedding, and other biodegradable materials. A moisture content of 50 to 60% provides the microbial activity with water and moisture that it needs to survive. And this is done through water and food scraps and the microorganisms themselves. Creating structural porosity of 35 to 50% leads to pile stability and airflow. And this is usually achieved through bulking agents such as wood chips. And then air, because these microorganisms are aerobic, is achieved through using a front loader or other equipment or having an aeration system. Composting takes about 20 to 120 days, depending on the method, plus an additional crucial period of 4 to 6 months or longer for curing or aging the material to make the final product and ensure that good, healthy microorganisms are retained in that product. All operations need to achieve time and temperature requirements to reduce pathogens and stabilize the nutrients in the finished material. It is the entirety of this process, a proper recipe, air, moisture, and meeting the appropriate time and temperature requirements that ensures that pathogens are killed and beneficial microorganisms can be established and thrive to produce quality compost that meets the intended use. So the nutrient profile is again dependent on the compost recipe, which provides a species of bacteria and fungi that lead to healthy compost and healthy soil. The analysis of finished compost, which you would want to have as a compost user, will tell you the amount of organic material or carbon in the compost and the phosphorus, nitrogen, and other nutrients contained in there. So for an example, when applying compost in the Lake Champlain Basin region, consideration must be given to the analysis of the compost to be applied, the phosphorus and nitrogen in the soil, and the ability for the plants to uptake these nutrients for the project that you're working and using the compost with. Adequate carbon in the compost recipe and the establishment of vegetation on the site are key to nutrient management, healthy soil, and water quality. We'll be delving more into these topics this morning, but they will also be covered in greater depth in our other modules and webinars, including our upcoming webinar on compost-based best management practices. So now we'd love to hear what you think compost does for soil. If you can please write your answers into the chat box, Natasha will read your responses.
So increasing organic percent. They're coming in fast now. Helping curb erosion, improving the soil structure and forming aggregates, adding minerals, improving tilth. These are all great.
You all are certainly good experts.
Yeah, increasing water holding capacity.
This is great. Thank you. Composting adds to healthy soil by improving biological conditions. So as we mentioned, nutrients, adding live microorganisms, which is crucial. And then all of this also helps to reduce pest populations so that the vegetation can thrive and the healthy organisms can thrive as well. So composting also improves the chemical characteristics of soil, providing nitrogen, phosphorus, and microorganisms. And then, so the relative amount of these materials and these nutrients and nitrogen and phosphorus and other chemical characteristics of the soil does depend on the compost feedstocks and composting practices, as we alluded to. So the other factors is it provides an optimum pH for plants in the soil to grow, and then the cation exchange capacity, which is crucial for determining the healthy fertility management of the soil. So again, and then what was mentioned for physical characteristics is it does add soil tilth, which you have to have good soil tilth for proper seed germination, root growth, deeper soil penetration of the roots. A healthy soil and the physical characteristics of compost lead to better water infiltration in the soil and retention, which protects the soil surface, increases soil porosity, which is good for water storage, and enhanced air circulation in the soil for the microorganisms. And then, of course, aggregation and structure, which helps soil to resist erosion, saturation, and other stresses. So healthy soil improves water filtration, and it holds more water to support microbes and invertebrates within the soil. Compost brings carbon, organic matter, nutrients, and live organisms to the soil, improving soil structure, helping to absorb and bind nutrients and moisture, facilitating a vegetative base. It's the living interaction that provides infiltration and soil stabilization to keep soil and nutrients in place so they don't flow into our waterways. For example, in Lake Champlain, some forms of phosphorus fuel cyanobacteria, which Marc mentioned is the blue and green algae that we have so many issues with in the lake. So in healthy soils, phosphorus binds with soil particles that erode from stream banks. When it's in this particulate form, which is helped by healthy soils and carbon in compost, the phosphorus is inaccessible to the cyanobacteria. It may take months or years for this phosphorus to be released in the lake in a form that it can be used by cyanobacteria growth. Also, better moisture retention means less watering and allowing us to conserve water and reduce runoff pollution. A 1% increase in organic matter in the top 6 inches can hold 27,000 gallons of water per acre. That slows and channels stormwater to where it belongs rather than into our waterways. So it's all these factors that compost helps to bring healthy soil and vegetation. So I am going to go over the last part of the video that we saw from Penn State.
Healthy roots need air and water. When it rains, we want the rain to infiltrate into the soil, capturing it in the root zone where plants can get it. But we also want the soil to drain so the roots are not submerged in water without enough oxygen. The infiltration rate is an important soil property. It determines how much rainfall will infiltrate into the soil and how much will run off the soil surface. Here we can measure how quickly 1 inch of rain would infiltrate into soil from different parts of the orchard. We want to minimize runoff because it not only takes water, but nutrients and topsoil off of our field and into streams and rivers. When rainfall runs off, it's lost from the soil profile where it could be stored for plant use. Infiltration is mostly determined by the size of pores between aggregates, soil texture, and holes left by roots, insects, and earthworm burrows. When the soil surface becomes compacted by tractor tires or foot traffic, pores are compressed and infiltration decreases. Heavy tractors and traffic, especially when soils are wet, can compact the soil. Water will run off compacted soil crusts on the soil surface. Roots cannot penetrate compacted layers deep in the soil. We can measure soil compaction with a soil penetrometer. When we hit a layer that takes more than 300 pounds per square inch of pressure to penetrate, we know that roots cannot penetrate either. This is the depth we want to run the ripper, or we can plant biodrilling cover crops to break up that hard pan.
So healthy soils create an environment for soil organisms to thrive in through a porous matrix, which makes for looser soil for the roots to grow and be healthy, and more air for the microorganisms. It provides physical structure, which helps for better water management and improving water relations and helping for drought resistance that way through the water storage and keeping runoff from going into our waterways, and allows for nutrient availability. So it provides a balanced diet for the plants and a sustained release from the nutrients for longer viability of the plants, and also for biological resistance to pests. Healthy soil is alive. It's teeming with microorganisms and microscopic animals. As Marc mentioned, healthy soil has enough microorganisms contained in 1 teaspoon of healthy soil, more than the people on the planet, or hundreds of thousands, if you can imagine that. These microorganisms serve to provide nutrients and protection for plants to grow and thrive. And again, these microorganisms also help plants to uptake phosphorus and nutrients and keep those bound up in the soil, and for the microorganisms to use those to thrive, and also the plants to thrive. Microorganisms work with the plant roots to nourish plants, and in turn, the plants nourish the underground ecosystem. Carbon molecules in healthy soil ensure that this symbiotic relationship flourishes. And it is this relationship between healthy soil and thriving plant life that helps to protect our waterways. So compost regulates the nutrient flows. Here we can see to visualize how compost and organic matter serve to help create a healthy soil matrix. Compost holds the nutrients at a landscape level by reducing water flow and thus loss of dissolved nutrients, and reducing erosion because nutrients adhere better to the soil. Excessive phosphorus and nitrogen reaching our waterways leads to a process called eutrophication. Water quality can be improved through the application of compost. Again, compost increases soil's ability to retain water and thus decreases runoff. Runoff pollutes water by carrying soil, fertilizers, and pesticides to nearby streams and waterways, and thus ends up in our lakes and larger water bodies. A 5% increase in organic matter quadruples the soil's ability to store water. So again, excessive phosphorus and nitrogen use causes pollution in our surface waterways and also contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. Healthy soil structure and vegetative root growth both hold water and also filter and bind nutrients such as the nitrogen and phosphorus to reduce runoff into our waterways. Compost can reduce or eliminate use of synthetic fertilizers, which can more often contribute to excess nitrogen and phosphorus in the water. So sort of a dual-fold action there by adding compost and creating healthy soil. Compost reduces the need for chemical pesticides because it contains beneficial microorganisms to protect plants from diseases and pests. Compost also helps the soil to act as a carbon sink. So ultimately, when we feed soil compost and healthy soils grow vegetation, which form a base to hold soil and nutrients in place and protect our water. Getting the compost recipe right, adhering to the entire compost process to produce a quality product, and selecting the right compost product for the application will help us protect the Lake Champlain Basin. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Natasha, and thank you very much for listening to our presentation.
I'd like to take just a minute before we get into Q&A, to give a little promo for some of the other upcoming webinars that we have. The Drivers for Clean Water and Healthy Soil is going to be a shorter pre-recorded webinar on the sort of how we got here, why are there so many organic diversion laws coming in across the states, and certainly, in Vermont, it goes into Vermont specific regulations that govern some of the not only organics diversion, but clean water rules. And then our best management practices for compost and compost-based products is going to be March 23rd, and you'll be receiving announcement and details about how to register for that. And just to give you a little flavor of what that is going to be, I'm going to go over how compost can be used in a whole lot of different ways, from amending compacted soil for revegetation in athletic fields or along roadways, to spot treatment for individual plantings and in agriculture. It can also be blown on as compost blankets to hold either bare soil or freshly seeded soil in place. Sometimes the grass seed is actually blended right into the compost that's blown on. And then there's also these things called compost socks or filter socks. And there's a lot of different varieties. And depending on the use for them, the actual material, the medium that's in those socks is going to change. And so again, we just really want to be highlighting that there are different types of compost and compost materials or blends that need to be matched with the appropriate use. So we are supporting water quality as opposed to potentially degrading it. And there's also compost berms that we'll be touching on in that module. And you can see how effective, especially compared to silt fences, that a berm can be at keeping eroded soil in place, or at least preventing it from acting as a boundary. And here's another example of a berm on a roadway that's protecting anything from the road from washing down into the waterway, down into the wood stream there. As a quick example, this is one of the projects that the Composting Association of Vermont did in Royalton. They were having problems with this bank continuously eroding into this waterway. And here on the left, you can see VTrans is our Department of Transportation standard 6-inch grub soil with larger rocks seeded. A lot of that washed away pretty immediately with the first couple rains. This middle section here is just a control transect, just rocks, but it actually looks pretty close to what the standard procedure is. And then over on the right was a mix of compost socks and blankets. And you can see that the soil in place long enough for the vegetation to start taking root. Then those roots also help hold everything in place. And there's much less sedimentation and debris actually entering the waterway from this scenario. So these are some of the things that we'll be talking about and going into case studies of best management practices in that module in March. If you have any questions, you can always feel free to reach out to me and I can connect you up to other folks, other presenters afterwards. And so now we're going to go into Q&A. One question that came in early on, and Mark, I think this was in reference to one of your slides, is whether there was a way to have a rain garden if you don't have gutters on your house.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'm finishing up a new addition to the Vermont Rain Garden Manual, which hopefully will be in print within a few months. And we're encouraging a holistic approach to stormwater management on someone's property. Rainwater from a gutter can be directed into a rain garden, but also any water that's flowing over your property can be channelized through gentle swales and channelways, pathways that are planted, vegetated swales, for example, that will guide water in the direction you want into the rain garden. So sort of naturally vegetated swales or gentle pathways to take the water in the directions where you want it to go into some place where it can be absorbed.
Yeah. And I imagine, and you probably touch on this as well, Mark, in the manual, but your natural landscape is going to play into siting, I would think, as well for that. Absolutely. In terms of there are things that you can do to build swales to help channel that water, but a lot of it is also understanding how water naturally flows on your landscape and leveraging that for that practice. Athena, this one is for you. There was a question about whether, when you talked about curing and how long that can take, is the curing for home composting still 4 to 6 months? Or would that be longer?
With home composting, maybe not, it doesn't need to be quite as long, but you always want to cure your compost, because even if you're just using it on your garden or your local landscape, you want those beneficial microorganisms to get in there, and that will only happen through the curing process. Additionally, you never want to put fresh compost on that's not been cured on your plants, because it can leach away nitrogen from your plants.
Yeah. And really it depends on the system you're using. It can be shorter, especially if you're using a tumbler or if you're really managing it and turning it and making sure everything is decomposing. But I also know a lot of home composters who use kind of what I think of as the nest method, where they just take a bin and they line it and kind of make a nest out of leaves and then just keep adding food scraps and some more leaves into it. And that can take up to a year to really decompose if you're not turning it or doing, it's more of a passive compost if you're not doing any management of it. So it really depends on the system. So then another question is that they've heard the argument or perspective that organic farmers might be adding too much compost to their gardens, because we've always been advised to add compost to improve organic matter. How do we know if we've added too much?
So for me anyway, the best way to know how much compost to add is to, one, know your compost. So make sure you have a compost analysis to know what nutrients are in that compost. And then also get a soil analysis before you start your planting. And even for organic farmers, I was an organic farmer, and that's what we did. Every year you get a soil analysis. And then it also depends on the plants you're using. So know what your plants need. It's like some plants required a little more nitrogen or a little more phosphorus. So that would be the other factor you'd want to weigh in there.
Great, thank you. So another person says, after inheriting a garden area, they had the soil tested and it showed excessive phosphorus. How can she lower the phosphorus level in her garden? She's getting straying a little bit, but we'll go ahead and take it.
I think, again, look for compost that has a high enough carbon in it, lots of organic matter and a lot of carbon, and that will help to bind the excess phosphorus in your soil. And then make sure you have a really good ground cover over your soil, so lots of healthy vegetation, because that too will bind then the phosphorus.
Great. So here's one about, does growing a monoculture also contribute to runoff? Do either of you want to take that one?
Well, I'll start and then maybe Mark. So from my point of view, growing monocultures are not really good. And so even though a lot of farmers do that just economically, you at least would want to rotate what your monoculture. So you have a field of corn one year and then soybeans on the other side, and then at least rotate those. And so there's a lot of resources out there to tell you how to do that. You don't want to plant things in the same place because they create pathogens within the soil that may hurt those plants eventually. And then also monocultures do catch or do bind up a lot of the nutrients and rob those from the soil. So they don't return anything to those soils unless you're adding a lot of compost to that. And a lot of farmers don't add enough compost or other nutrients. So Mark?
Sure. The mantra for managing stormwater is to slow it down, spread it out, and soak it in. Some plants are better at slowing the flow and spreading it out. Corn stalks are not quite as good at reducing the flow as dense grasses or things. So the filtration is, so that's a part of it. Another aspect of the monoculture is you've got perhaps less diversity of chemistry going on in the soil because you've got one type of plant, one species of plant doing its chemistry, but the microorganisms would really love to benefit from it, the sugars and other molecules coming from a different type of plant. Monocultures may not create as much diversity in the soil as a diverse system.
Great, thank you. How much of the soil in our state would benefit from different types of compost, And are we manufacturing the needed types of compost too much or too little? I wanted to address that, and if someone wants to jump in, but we're going to be touching on a lot of that in that best management soil builders module that we referenced. That's going to be on March 23rd in terms of the different types of compost and are we manufacturing it. But really, a lot of our state could benefit from compost or from an increase in organic matter to some extent, right? We're trying to build that sponge to, as Marc said, to let as much rainfall as possible infiltrate where it lands. That's the ideal, because that relieves the pressure of the volume of stormwater that we have to manage in another, with other mechanisms. In terms of different types of compost and are we manufacturing the different kinds, there is a little bit of an issue of that in Vermont, and we are starting to expand some of that. The different types of compost that we need, if they're not yet available in state, and we're working towards that, they're certainly available in neighboring states. Do either of you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I've got the big picture is we have been importing phosphorus into Vermont for well over 100 years. Plants and animal tissue contain phosphorus. Phosphorus is essential for life. So the salad greens that come from California, the beef coming from the Midwest has phosphorus in it. When we excrete material or we're composting plants, for example, that phosphorus goes into compost. So compost can contain phosphorus. And one of the questions for, I think, the long-term management of phosphorus in our watersheds is which parts of our watershed are already overloaded with phosphorus, and we really should be careful as to how much phosphorus we're applying to those areas, and which parts of our watershed can take some more and bind it up and not a problem. So the universal use of compost may not be the most efficacious strategy, but there are certainly many, many places where phosphorus are welcomed, and we should be thinking strategically as to where are those places, because the mass budget of phosphorus is increasing in the state. We're bringing it in every day in animal feeds, human food, and then as we compost those plants, that phosphorus is now imported into our system. So, and then the big question is, how do we get to a state, or could we ever get to a state where we begin to export phosphorus and change that balance? So that's just the big picture. But compost is certainly very helpful and very essential in many, many parts of the watershed, but we need to be careful that there are certain places where the soils may already be overloaded, or the soils will be saturated for way too long and phosphorus can be released. So that's just one big picture thing that we'll have to work through in the coming months and years.
Yeah, and I just want to add that not all, and we've said this a couple times, not all compost has the same nutrient profile. So there is compost that has higher phosphorus and nutrient levels, and there is compost that has pretty low phosphorus in it. And that is part of why you need to understand how the compost is made, what went into it, those feedstocks that Athena touched on. That the process can impact not only the nutrient profiles, but also the different microbial profiles that are within that compost. And then as well, lab analysis is really key to understand, has everything been put together right? And is this the material or the compost medium that you want to be using for a specific intervention? And so and we're going to be getting a lot more into detail in those nuances, but really part of why we created the Soil Builders curriculum and are really wanting to get it out there and start educating people is I think there is this tendency to just think compost is compost, and it's probably that really rich stuff that you get for, as like growing media for organic gardens, that dark black stuff. But there's all different kinds, and there's also different kinds of blends, and it can get confusing. And we'll be breaking that down really when we get into the other modules. This is really just to get everybody sort of on the same page of why we're having this conversation and how understanding how healthy soil functions can support water quality as well. But for sure, that's a key, what Marc said. One question that I don't actually know the answer to, but Marc, you might, does the rainwater manual, and I assume that means the stormwater manual, address gray water management?
I'm not
I
sure
focus, it's a
about
big
that.
manual and I look at other sections, so I'm not really
Yes.
sure about that.
I haven't looked at that part of the stormwater management manual myself.
And there is a link directly to the entire manual. You can also find that with a Google search. And then I would just do like a, find gray water and see what comes up. That's just not a piece that I usually get into in that manual. Let's see, we're doing okay for time. So we're going to take a couple compost questions. Athena, probably for you to take first stab at, what does compost curing involve? But just briefly.
Just you set it in a pile and you let it sit and you turn it occasionally just to give more air to the microorganisms, because the point is that while it'll heat up some, especially in a commercial operation, but the compost is in its cooling down phase, but it still has lots and lots of microorganisms, and those are the microorganisms that you want to thrive in the compost, because those are the ones that will be alive and vital and thriving in healthy soil. So you let it set. You want to cover it if it's a home composting operation, so you don't get rainwater that leaches out those valuable nutrients and microorganisms. And that's it.
Great. And do you think after hot composting last summer, then curing over the winter, is that a satisfactory time frame? Can that compost now be used this spring?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I agree as well. Especially if it's the hot composting. And really the best, there's another question about, how do you test home composting? And one of the simplest ways to do it is the plastic bag test. Do you want to talk about that, Athena?
Sure. If you put your compost into a plastic bag, it shouldn't heat up and it'll have some moisture particles, and it should smell good. It shouldn't smell like a rotten egg or ammonia or, anything bad. It should smell earthy. Yeah. And that'll tell you if the compost is complete. And then you can even just send your compost, particularly for home composters, in to get a basic soil test. And that'll tell you what your nitrogen is and your levels. So that if you are concerned, I would recommend doing that. It's cheap.
Yep. And the other way to tell is also just doing a bioassay. So like grow something before you spread it all over a field or, pile it into your garden. I often will just use like the paper egg crates, and put little bits of soil in and just plant seeds and stick it in my window and see what grows. And the germination rate should be about what you would expect for whatever you're growing, whether it's tomatoes or beans. And that's one way that you can just tell if your compost is ready, is going to be, supportive for growing plants.
And that's a good recommendation for any size compost operation.
That's right. Commercial facilities often do the grow tests as well. They'll have greenhouses with plants potted up and see how it is. And that's it's a good feedback mechanism for home or commercial. And we will be touching on lab analysis in that best management practice module in terms of how do you tell the difference between the different materials? What are you looking for? And what are we go into some of the specifications. This is one of the questions. Some of the specifications that you want to be looking for either compost or compost-based products, right? So it's not always just 100% compost. It's either blends or different types of compost media that are applied in different ways. And we'll be going over all of the specifications in that March 23rd Soil Builders module. So these are great questions. I haven't seen any other ones come in. Here's one that I missed. Is slime mold a saprophilic fungi? And is there a way to increase saprophilic fungi on riverbanks? I'm not actually sure the answer to that. Do either you guys want to take that?
Mark?
I don't know exactly, but slime molds are amazing things. And I believe they are fungi, but I'm not sure about how to answer your question. It would be great to find ways to encourage them because they are amazing. One thing I do know about slime molds is they exhibit this property called emergent complexity, much like the pattern of ants on a forest floor. No ant is in charge, and how does that community move about? A flock of birds flying in the air is emergent complexity, where higher levels of order come about by the simple relationship of different actors. For example, for birds, 3 rules can govern these amazing patterns we see of a flock of birds. 1, don't bump into your neighbor. 2, don't get too far away from your neighbor. And 3, if there's a predator coming, get out of the way. And this pattern just emerges of these organisms flying. It's a complex pattern that we can't predict the movement of any given organism. And slime molds also have the ability, and they're also starting to think that slime molds may actually be a new form of intelligence. They may actually be intelligent beings in the way that they make decisions because of their complex emergent behavior. Well, leave it at that.
Yeah, we're getting love that in the comments.
Yes.
So great.
That's great.
Excellent.
They're cool stuff.
Yeah.
Well, if there's no other questions, thank you so much for joining us. And that seems like a nice note to leave it on.
Scare people away.
And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good rest of your day.